So I'd like to welcome everybody to HR Covered's latest webinar in our webinar series, Performance Management for Private and Union Employers. You may recall that our last webinar that we did kind of an overview of some of the topics that we believe from an HR point of view, or at the very least, a business owner's point of view, and you're managing your own HR. These are topics that you really need to know about to, functionally, effectively have an HR framework in your corporation. So this is the first of the ones that we covered in that more macro webinar. We're going to break it down a little bit deeper. So hopefully you'll see a little bit of recap for the people that were at the first one, but hopefully you'll be able to have a few takeaways. Yeah, let's get going. As soon as my slide decides it wants to move. I'm the HR guy, I'm not the IT guy, so you know. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Darcy. I'm the VP of HR Services at HR Covered. I'm excited to be your host today. I'm not alone. I have my co-host with me, Tar Heel. He is in fact the HR Covered mascot. The nature of COVID and working from home, and anybody who's ever been on any of my other webinars before, they know that Tar Heel is typically here somewhere lingering in the background. On occasion, he might speak out. He's very opinionated. He's not just a cute dog. As you can see, he has a certified human resource dog designation. So he has all the right in the world to speak, and he often trumps me on most things. And then, of course, the legal disclaimer. And to jump right in, to discuss our webinar, just to get started, this is a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So everybody is muted during the course of the webinar just to make sure it's an enjoyable experience for everyone. But please do put any questions you have in the Q&A screen, or however it goes, it shows up on my screen. And at the end, I will pop that up and I'll answer as many questions as I can in the time permitting. And usually we ended up going about a half hour over last week's webinar. I'm sticking around answering, or last month's webinar, sticking around answering questions. So yeah, feel free to ask whatever HR questions you have, whether it be about this presentation or otherwise. So to get started, why performance management is important and what you should be measuring. Legal considerations and common reasons performance management systems fail. There is a couple of things there where, even the employers that I deal with on a day-to-day basis that have terrific performance management systems have not accounted for a few legal considerations, which seem kind of remoter in the background, but you never know that your performance management system is not enforceable until you get to that end where you try to terminate somebody and then you're told by a ministry inspector or a judge that in fact what you did all along, albeit good in practice, it didn't have the basis or framework to be actually enforceable by law. So we'll talk about that today. What you need to know to facilitate a successful performance management system. And then again, the title of this webinar is Performance Management in Union and Non-Unionized Environments. Of course, my phone's going off while we're doing this. So we'll talk about some performance management in unionized environments and a few things you consider. You don't reinvent the wheel when you go from a unionized environment to a non-unionized environment. Performance management principles, best practices, et cetera, do overlap, but there's a few considerations that unionized employers have that non-unionized employers do not have to deal with, for lack of better words. So we'll talk about how you might be able to mitigate some of those concerns and how you can turn what could be obstacles into best practice. So the importance of performance management and desired outcomes. This is a little bit of recap for the people that have been on the presentation prior, but as I said in that presentation, I always make sure I include this because the nexus of a good performance management system should be, what are you trying to get out of it? Otherwise, performance management is that dreaded thing. All your operational management hate it. It's hours out of their week or their months or their year. Your employees dread it. They find it to be punitive. They find it to be taxing as far as their time is concerned. So it's really important that whatever it is that you want to get out of your performance management system, you understand that in advance. Like most things when it comes to business goals, achieving ROI, HR goals, et cetera, it's really important to have a starting point. So first and foremost, and there's a legal consideration to this, which we'll get to, but the first and most desirable aspect of your performance management program should not be to discipline. That's completely contrary to what performance management is. If you want to discipline somebody, put them through your performance management process. Performance management is about making your people better. It's about making your company better. This is an opportunity that gets lost, especially in today's remote world, we'll talk about a little bit, that gets lost too often, where you get an opportunity to recognize and reward your employees. If you as an HR department, if you as a company are doing your jobs right throughout the year, and performance management is an annual process. It's not once a year, it's all year. If you're doing your jobs right throughout the year, 9 out of every 10 employees, you will sit down at performance management time. It's an opportunity for you to say thank you, because that means you're supporting them to the place they need to be. If half of your employees that you sit down at performance management are left with constructive criticism or constructive, kind of feedback to go back and say, you need to do better, you're not reaching your goals, you really have to look at, what your performance management system is and what in fact is, what are you measuring, which we'll talk about for sure. Non-for-cause terminations. So this is specific, going back to the title of what we're talking about today. This is a consideration that non-union employers do not have to consider, where union employers do. So what I mean by that is, in a non-union environment, for most things, with the exception of breaking the Human Rights Code or Employment Standards Act, you can terminate somebody without cause for whatever reason you want, provided you're willing to pay them the money. They can have red hair, and you might not like that, as long as you don't tell them that's the reason you terminate them. If you give them their appropriate ESA or ESC, statutory, termination pay and whatever common law they might be entitled to, you don't have to provide a reason when you terminate without cause. You just have to pay them. Unionized environment, employers aren't so lucky. You have to have a reason. You have to follow a process. For unionized employers, the performance management process is one of the most important tools in your toolbox, simply because it is a management right. It is not a union right. We'll talk about that later. It's a management right. You have the right to implement it. You have the right to constructively provide constructive feedback to your union members, your employees, first and foremost, union members second. And that's why this process is important. So performance management, as far as desired outcomes, your performance management in a unionized environment has to be built as such that it's enforceable in the end. Measure increased productivity. So we're going to talk about what you should be measuring, but after the end of the day, I don't care if you're a non-for-profit. I don't care if you're a for-profit. It honestly doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you're a non-for-profit, your goal is to make sure that you bring in enough funding, to bring in enough funds that you can deliver on what it is that is the passion, is the supports in the community, whatever it is that you do for a non-for-profit that you provide. If you're for-profit, if you're a for-profit, it's a little bit more clear cut. Your goal is ROI. So whether you be a non-for-profit or a profit, whether it's, to provide great community supports and, community service, or whether it's to actually make the most money you can as a company, at the end of your day, if your performance management system isn't measuring those things, then what are you doing, right? Like, at the end of the day, everybody comes to work. Yes, the employee needs purpose in their job. Great. What's the purpose tied to? Making money, delivering community support on a not-for-profit. And I know not-for-profits do other things. I'm just going down that rabbit hole because it's easy. So, but at the end of the day, if your performance management system is not tied directly to that, if you're just grading people on, oh, they show up for work on time, oh, they have a pleasant temperament in the elevator or in the lunchroom, and that's what you're grading people on, you really have to refocus on what it is your performance management system is, and if you're actually just wasting your own time rather than doing something that is a tool for you. Okay, so let's focus on output. Now, one of the things that I'm a big believer on, I argue with people on LinkedIn all the time. I don't care. It's a good argument to have. Everybody should be opinionated about this, because that's how we find best practices. That's how we get better and become great at our craft. Focusing on output is something that the pandemic taught us. When you see that person that's sitting in the corner, 5:38 p.m. and the workday's over at 5, and you walk out of your office in the corner and you say, wow, what a dedicated, loyal employee. And then you see the 3 desks next to them, and you can tell they not only didn't make it till 5 o'clock, they left a little bit earlier. You're prone to give that person, for output that you're not measuring necessarily, you're prone to focus on that person and say that person's a dedicated employee, that person's a great employee, that person deserves high marks in their performance management, and we'll make sure that when it comes appraisal time, we reward them. Where in fact, those other 2 people that left an hour early were able to get all of their work done and get it done well in 7 hours for what this person's taking 8.5 hours to do, right? That's called presentism. At the end of the day, what the pandemic did, and hybrid work and performance management in a hybrid environment, is it forced us to focus on the outcomes we're receiving. I don't care, and I tell my consultants this on my team all the time, I don't care if you check out for an hour in the afternoon. I don't care if you decide to have an adult beverage at 4:30 instead of the end of the day at 5 o'clock when you should be doing that, right? It doesn't matter to me. If your clients are happy, your delivery numbers are good, and the company as a total, because your clients are happy, because your delivery numbers are good, we're making money. Do what you need to do. Work when it's best for you. I want to focus on the outcomes. I don't want to focus on when and how they work. Okay, so those are things that you need to take into consideration. And again, the most important thing there that is really like, I think that everybody needs to take a step back, because I can tell you that I'd say 2 out of every 10 performance management systems that I've audited have a focus directly tied to ROI or outcomes of your non-for-profit. It's typically more the day-to-day interactions, thinking that that will automatically, translate into greater ROI, but not necessarily if your process is all the way down the line from job descriptions to performance management to production to ROI actually all align. And that's not easy. So it needs to start somewhere. By the way, caveat, I talk fast. This is being recorded. So if you miss anything, don't worry, because I'll always get 1 or 2 comments in the Q&A or comment section. Can you slow down? All of this is being recorded. So anybody who's here today is going to get a copy of this presentation, and it's going to be recorded. So it'll be on demand for whenever you need it. So please, I'm trying to fit in a lot of content in what would be 45 minutes. So I beg your forgiveness in advance. So what should your desired outcomes be? Again, we discussed this a little bit already, so I'm not going to belabor this slide, and it was in the last presentation as well, but employers need to change their mindset. Again, the presentism example I use about someone working OT versus someone who's more effective and get it done quicker, that really drives that point home. So again, the same, if you're using, especially for those folks that have people that are doing hybrid or have people that are working remotely, and even for those people that have people in the office, but they haven't, really taken a look at their performance management system for what it should be measuring. If you're using the same dynamics and metrics and measurements that you were using for an in-house performance management system for your remote or hybrid employees and trying to measure whether or not they're doing a good job by the standards we're holding them to, then you're out of date. The system has changed, the world has changed, your systems need to change too. So that's something you need to really go back and take a look at. Break it all down, and say, are we really measuring output? And because we can't measure their activity on a day-to-day basis unless you're one of those companies that's going to install tracking software and things of that nature, which again, I'm not judging. I'm just saying, if you're going to install track, then that changes things a little bit. But most companies that have their workers in a hybrid or remote workplace do so because they trust their employees to come out with good outputs. So you have to make sure that your performance management system is measuring that. And it's, the metrics and the standards and, all those different types of things meet up with that. Again, we've already belabored that point, so I won't go over it. Basically, your desire of your PM process. I actually jumped ahead in the last slide a little bit more than I should have, but anyways, we got lots to cover. So, but your PM system should be designed to increase your ROI, not just measure it, to increase your ROI. If you think about it from this perspective, if performance management is about rewarding your employees for doing great, right? You're never going to tell an employee that you can't be better. Employees, I can be better. I've been doing HR for 28 years. I can be better, right? It is a goal, believe it or not. It is a goal when I get up every week. I read case law every single day. My goal is to know as much as I possibly can know every single day because I want to be better. So even your best employees can do better. Your employees who are doing okay, they can do better. And your employees that are not doing the greatest, either going to do better or they might have to step aside. One way or the other, whether it be through good attrition, and there is such a thing, or your employees being better, which your performance management system can help them achieve, your performance of your employees will get better. That will translate into better ROI. It's not just about measuring your ROI, it's about increasing your ROI. If you have an effective performance management system, it will pay for itself tenfold. Right? There's tons of studies on this, by the way. I didn't bring any to this webinar, and maybe I should have, but there's tons of studies that show if you have an effective performance management system that works to measure and increase your ROI, if you invest $100,000 into it, you will make $1 million. Seriously. So, this is how you get there. We'll talk about some best practices. But before we get to the best practices, this is something you got to know where your potholes are before you can start running, right? So this is an important slide in so much as the first part of this slide is why 9 out of 10, I'm not exaggerating, 90%. I can give you a couple of examples of some big companies that'll fall flat here and just recently, where they started off their performance management system as a punitive tool. That in the first page of the performance management system, which for some of these bigger companies, municipal government companies, are upwards of 12, 15 pages long. In the first page of the performance management program or their attendance management program, somewhere in that first page, it talks about outcomes. And one of the outcomes is termination or discipline. Can't happen. That first page, and I'm being kind of I got symbolic, if you will, about the first page. The nexus of your performance management system, in order for you to ever get a termination for cause at the end, must be non-punitive. It must be constructive. It must be supportive. It cannot be seen as a punitive tool in its nexus. And again, just like progressive discipline, when you do a progressive discipline or you do a performance management review, 99% of the time, because it would be very specific that you would ever call to the mat for something, you will never know what you're doing is right or wrong. It's only when you get through the year and a half of performance management or the 6 months of progressive discipline and you get in front of a judge or a tribunal or a human rights person, and that's when they tell you, yo, you know, that first performance management meeting you had, or the policy that you have, that is disciplinary in its nexus. You can't start a process that is supposed to be constructive in a disciplinary measure and end up with the outcome that would determine a for-cause outcome. So it's super important. Go back and read your performance management program. Look at the way you do things. Is your first performance appraisal? I had a client the other day, and they might be on the call. So this is very enlightening for everybody. I'm going to share your scenario with everybody else, where they do have an employee that they would like to terminate. They've only been there for a year, which is great because they don't have formal performance management in place, but that gives them some time because they've only been there for a year to start it up. They have to disregard the first year, even if the employee was the worst employee in the world. As far as the court is concerned, that employee is at least an acceptable behavior, because you, the employer whose responsibility it rests with, did not have a performance management system in place. Absent of the employer, and this is in all things, by the way, folks, absent of the employer fulfilling their responsibilities and their obligations, the court or administrative labor tribunal or a human rights tribunal will always take the side of the employee 100%. They don't have any obligations in this process. This is all the employer. So if you're not doing performance management, the court will always assume that in that period of time when they never had an appraisal, that they were a good employee. So for this employee, they wanted to start off with a PIP. And I explained to them why they can't do that for the reason I'm talking about today, because a PIP is a disciplinary process. It is part of the performance management process, but there is a time when performance management turns from constructive to disciplinary. That's it. You can't start there. The first performance management process they need to have with that person is a meeting and appraisal. It has to talk about what they did wrong or what they're doing wrong, what supports you can provide to make sure they can do what they're going to do right, clearly outline what they're going to be doing right, and then the clear consequences of what might happen going forward. With the exception of performance management, that's progressive discipline. With the exception of performance management, in that first letter or that first performance appraisal, the consequences of the first performance management appraisal can't be discipline right out of the gate, right? It's going to take at least 2 meetings. Systemic discrimination. So this is one of the things you really need to look at in your performance management. And I'm not going to belabor this point because it's a whole nother topic onto itself. But when you look at things like discrimination and DEI, if you actually took a close look, and I have a lot of requests for this from clients right now, if you actually took a close look at your hiring process, of your succession process, of your reward process, of your performance management process, and you broke it down and say, I'm going to break this down and look at it from the lens of DEI or discrimination, you will surprise yourself by how many barriers are built into your performance management system, are built into your hiring policy that you don't see because they've always been there, right? And you never look at a policy through the lens necessarily of DEI or discrimination, but it's really important because that's what these outcomes now are being challenged on the basis that the policy or the process was systemically or inherently discriminatory in nature, which means it's not going to hold in the end. So it's super important. And along the same lines, talk about accessibility. So accessibility for persons with disabilities, whether it be a visible disability or non-visible disability, that is part of DEI, that is part of a discrimination. But across Canada, they now have laws that are specific to accessibility and people with disabilities. And one of those laws, and I'll use the AODA as an example in Ontario, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. One of those laws is that your performance management system and your promotion system has to account for people with disabilities. So if you have a performance management metric and that puts a person that has a cognitive illness or a learning disability, and they're being graded or measured on the same level as someone who does not have said cognitive illness or disability, then that's going to be a problem for you. So the AODA and other similar accessibility legislation across Canada makes it so that you have to look at that in your performance management system. The actual policy and process itself, it's not the application of it by itself. That too is important, but it's got to start with what's in writing. Okay. And then finally, for our union folks out there, our union employers are on the call, the collective agreement. It's super, super important. And this is a quasi-legal consideration. And what I mean by quasi-legal is that there's legal outcomes that cause you from you using performance management correctly or how you should be. In other words, performance management shouldn't be in your CA. I know, and I've got calls every time I do this presentation when we have performance management in our CA, and that's unfortunate. You never had to put it there. That's the nature of collective bargaining. A union's always going to ask, and an employer is going to do the same on their side. It goes both ways, but a union is always going to ask for something that they may not necessarily be entitled to a management right to be included under the guise of the collective agreement where it can be governed and the union can have some say in it. Once you put a management right in your collective agreement, the only thing you've done is put a downhill trajectory on your ability to manage that process, especially manage that process unilaterally. So it's super important that you're not fearful when you're doing performance management. We'll talk about this in the next slide of doing a providing constructive feedback and appraisal, or giving constructive feedback at all because you're worried about getting whether it could be challenged via the CA or you can get a grievance. So it's one thing to keep in mind for all you bargaining agents out there. I did that for about 10 years. It's not an easy job, by the way, so I get it. But if for all you bargaining agents out there, if you have the union and there's a proposal and you think you might be able to save $2 over here on a raise that they want, if you throw in the performance management system, don't do it. It's long-term pain for very short-term gain. So common mistakes for permanent, and this goes for both union and non-unionized employers. So this is always a slide that is met with some, some aha moments, typically some surprise on occasion, but typically it's some aha moments like, yeah, you know what, that's something we're dealing with. That's something I need to be trained on as an evaluator, or our evaluators need to be trained on. But one of the most common things is lack of differentiation. And you definitely get this in unionized environments more than not. So what ends up happening is that you have raters that lack confidence, or the number one reason why lack of differentiation happens is because management who put managers in a position to do performance management did not train their employees or their managers on performance management. Somewhere along the line, they just thought this was inherent, and they woke up one day, you slapped the title manager on them, and now they know how to do this, right? So that's certainly not the case. But what ends up happening is you get fearful of providing constructive criticism, whether it be to a unionized employee or someone that you might have to work with on a day-to-day basis, or maybe you're not I wouldn't call it aggressive, but you're not a firm manager. You have an issue with conflict and you would prefer not to have conflict and not. So what you do is tend to, come towards the middle, right? And then no employee is that much better than the other. So the horns and halo effect, this is one that's very common in all things. And it goes back to that example that I used about that person sitting in the office, working to 5:30. The person thinks, hey, they're great. They're a loyal employee. So even when they have shortcomings, that a manager that saw that person working till 5:30 that one day, every single thing they grade them on, they're a little bit biased. Even if they know that there's a couple of things that they're going to be grading them on that they're actually subpar or could use some support on, they will grade them a little bit higher because of the halo effect in that case. The horn effect is the exact same thing and far more common because it's more easy. Quite frankly, it's more easy, and we see this in society today. It's more easy to hate than it is to love, right? So when you find an employee who does something wrong or does something particular wrong, and it really bothers you, you're typically to grade a performance appraisal all the way through with a negative lens, okay? Personal bias or favoritism speaks for itself, but it's super important, and this goes to process. It's super, super, super important, and it is a legal consideration, by the way, I should have put it in there, that whatever tools you are using in your performance management system are built in such a way to eliminate personal bias or favoritism. There should be metrics. If you have 5 different managers that do performance management, for example, there should be a metrics with grading criteria of what every manager has to follow. So if manager 1 has an employee who's like an 8 out of 10 on anybody's scale, grades them as an 8, the manager 5 should be grading them the same way because they're looking at the criteria of what it means to get an 8 out of 10. Right? So that's how you eliminate personal bias and favoritism. Inaccurate information and preparation all the time. This is because performance management is like, it's not the only reason, but it's the primary reason. performance management is viewed as a hindrance, as a pain in the butt, right? So most managers don't go in prepared. They don't speak to when HR is doing performance management, they're not speaking to the frontline management that work with them every day to figure out, what's good, what's bad. Lack of consistency, that goes back. I'm going to speed up a little bit because we're already almost a half hour in. We got more to cover. But lack of consistency, that goes back to having a tool that makes sure that you can use KPIs. So manager 1 is grading the same similar systems to manager 2 as they are 3, 4, 5, and down the line. And then training. I alluded to it at the beginning of the slide. It's the number one thing why performance management fails outside of the logistical things that we talked about. At the end of the day, this is being a coach, doing performance management is not inherent. People aren't born leaders. I get the saying that, you're born a leader. You're certain attributes that people might be born with. There are certain attributes that people, whether they be management or not, that would lean to them or lend to them, begging your pardon, being a great leader or being a great manager or being good at coaching. But by itself, those attributes do not make you a leader, right? It is up to the employer when you assign, if you're going to take this seriously, if you're going to use this as a tool to make your employees better, to make your company better, to make your culture better, increase your ROI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, invest in your managers, train them how to do this properly. It's something we can help you with, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this is a responsibility that you should not tread lightly on. All of this, as great as it is, doesn't work if your managers aren't properly trained. So again, next 2 slides I'm going to zip through because there's a more technical slide that we're getting to that you probably all want to hear. These are the things you need to have a effective performance management system. Expectations and JDs, right? I tell my consultants, I tell my clients all the time, the reason this relationship will work is because we have good expectations with one another. If you email me in wanting an answer for something, you should realize that I will be able to get you that email back, that response to that email question that you provided me within this amount of time. Right? And that's why it works. That's why performance management works. You have to have clear expectations. It has to be reflected in your JD. If your job description, like your job posting is one thing. Too many companies make their job description and their job posting the exact same thing. If your job description doesn't have duties that are outlined to how you can achieve your ROI, you need to go read back and look at your job description. I'm not saying you have to blow everything up. I'm just saying go back and take like a really open to honest lens, look at it. I want to increase, this is what we need to do to get our ROI. We know what we need to do to increase profit this year. Do our job duties listed in our job description actually tell those employees what they need to do to make that happen? And if it doesn't, you need to go back and look at your job descriptions, because if you're building your performance management out of your job descriptions, that's problematic if your job descriptions are lacking, right? Development of goals, that's what we were just talking about. And the best way to do that is look at, if you're a non-for-profit, I like to use your outcomes, right? What is your community-based outcome? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Build your goals backwards. If you're an ROI, how much money are you trying to make? Build your goals backwards, right? SMART goals, so they're the most popular goals out there. I use them as an example. There's other metrics or there's philosophy as what it means or what's effective in the way of measuring goals or developing goals. But this is one of them. I put it in the slide because I thought it would be a helpful tool. I think most people have probably heard of it. Documentation, super important. I talked about this a little bit earlier, so I'm not going to belabor it again. But basically, performance reviews should be year-round. It shouldn't be just something where you sit down once a year. Our CEO, Matt, he used a great analogy when we started first working on performance management as a product for HR Covered. He goes, you wouldn't sit through, if you're a coach of a football team, you wouldn't sit through a football game and watch your blockers miss assignments and watch your running back go different cuts where they should have. And you have all the advice in the world to support them and, fix their errors mid-game. But instead, you waited till the end of the game, you've lost, and you lost badly. And then you pull all your team aside and say, hey, listen, these are the things that you're doing wrong during the game, which I'm prepared to help you with. We'll go get them next game. Parallel that to a year of business. Would you literally let a whole year go of doing business, noticing all your employees and, opportunities for improvement, opportunities to give praise? Would you wait the whole year before you sat down and pulled them aside and said, hey, let's do some coaching now? All year long. And then you document it for yourself, and then you formalize it, whether it be, quarterly, biannually, annually. That's all a performance review should be, is the formalization or formalizing of the constant coaching and conversations you've had with your employees all along. And again, coaching, what I just talked about. And there's the analogy. I was one step ahead of myself again, go figure. Organization skill isn't my, there's other things I'm good at. Organization isn't necessarily one of them. So coaching. So this is a slide in full transparency. Coaching is a niche. Some of the worst coaches in the world that I know are HR people, me included. I try to be a good leader. I try to lead by example, but coaching is something that, again, is you have to practice, you have to be good at, you have to be repetitive at. So this is something that I read that kind of resonated with me about process, preparation, and persistence. These are the qualities that make good coaches. And I actually use this, as much as it's a little bit niche-y and so much as that, you know, it gives you the 3 Ps. I actually use this as a guide whenever I'm falling short with an employee that I'm trying to support, or trying to support a client with an employee they're trying to support. I fall back on this every so often, and it's good to have things to fall back on, right? Because we can always, like I said at the beginning, we can always be better, right? So clarify the intentions and outcomes being sought from a coaching conversation. Expectations. Worst thing you ever do when you go into, because people, you got to understand, when you go into a process, whether it be discipline, performance management, whether you be married or have children, have your best friend, whenever you go into a process and you're going to talk about something that has the potential to be uncomfortable, or, you know, have criticism, the first thing that person hears, and this is human nature, it's adult learning 101, the first thing that person hears that's negative is what they are stuck with, right? That's where they're at. You could say all the nice things in the world thereafter, that first comment's never going to leave them. So it's super important for you to outline what you're going to do and what you're trying to achieve. If some constructive criticism might come up in there, tell them at the beginning, but tell them this is why we're doing it, because here's the outcomes and here's what we're going to try and achieve. Communication, again, kind of a two-way street, but I say it because common sense isn't so common always, and listening is as big as a part. I'm the worst for this. As you can tell by how much I'm talking, I do this all the time. Even when we're in conversation with our whole management team, if it comes to me, I'm going to talk. So this is one of those things that I think we all could be better at. Me first, but communication, listening, and receiving, that's super important. Inquisitive coaching, love this. Root causes. For all of you health and safety people on here, and I know there's at least 2 of you that are health and safety experts on this call, you will love this kind of coaching. It's about finding the cause to why somebody is making an error or not doing their performance. It's easy enough for any of us. Our kids can do it. Hey, you're supposed to do this. You didn't do this. What do you need to help? Why don't we try and figure out what it is, if there is something, because there's not always something. Sometimes it's just that simple. But what it is that's causing them to not get to the mark that you need them to get to. Maybe they need more support. Maybe they're not properly trained. Maybe they're having issues at home, right? It could be any number of things. Maybe they're having a personal issue that they don't necessarily want to talk about, but given the opportunity, they might, open up. So these are things, instead of asking them why they made a mistake, or telling them that they made a mistake, ask them, look into the why they made a mistake. And that's super supportive. And then any coaching, provide support. It's actually a legal requirement. Even in progressive discipline, for those people out there, because I've reviewed a couple of progressive discipline notes, and I know Chris is on here. So if you do not provide support in the nexus of progressive discipline, in other words, here's what you're doing wrong, the counseling, the first letter in a progressive discipline process should be counseling. Okay, most people call it a verbal warning. I hate that terminology because it's actually written, but call it counseling. There has to be something in that process in its nexus, no different than performance management, where when you're pointing out these things that they need to improve on, and then laying out expectations going forward, you identify the support they need to make that happen. Again, that obligation is on employers. The best place to provide that support is right here, coaching, right? Coaching is a support unto itself. Yes, you're being supportive in the coaching process, but coaching is a support upon itself. So here's a slide everybody gets really interested in. So when we have 10 minutes to get through these last, I think it's 2 slides, maybe 1. But we have a couple minutes, we have about 10 minutes to get through this, and then that gives us plenty of time for questions. So performance management and terminations. So as most of you know, in Canada, terminations for cause are hard. It's a really high bar to meet. For cause isn't crazy, because you're talking about the irreparable damage to an employment relationship, which an employer and employee can't come back from, specifically the employer as they're making the choice. In Ontario, it's the bar of willful misconduct in addition to for cause. It's 2 different things. It's the application of the ESA and the other is common law. But at the end of the day, willful misconduct is a egregious act or a series of egregious acts. That's one that is either, and here's the sticker, is either intentional or deliberate. right? The intentional or deliberate part is why we have process, because the idea that someone could have poor performance and you could terminate them for cause, and that poor performance is intentional or deliberate, in a lot of judges' minds, and in a layperson HR person's mind as well, it's kind of asinine. Maybe the person's just not good at their job. Maybe they're lazy. Do you know what I mean? Does that make it an egregious act? Does that make it intentional or deliberate? You have to be able to show that you've provided them with multiple occasion to see what they're doing wrong, to know what they need to do better, supports to be able to do better, and then clear consequences if they don't do better. All of that is a requirement in both progressive discipline and has to be in writing in every step. If you miss it in any one of the steps, you will not get a for cause termination. Okay, that's super important. Okay, all of that is a requirement to show that even though they were aware of what they needed to do or what they were doing wrong, what they needed to do, how to do it, were provided with support, and they knew the consequences of their action, they didn't do what they needed to do anyways 3 or 4 times in a row, which means their action or conduct was intentional or deliberate. That's the kicker. That's the glue, right? So if you didn't understand that before, that's why these processes and what's in every process, specifically in writing, is important. So a PIP, I just use this. We're at the part now where we've went through the first couple of stages of performance management. We've tried to encourage them to do better. Now we're at the point where we're turning it to discipline. Okay, so a PIP is a performance improvement plan. That's when it's the same as progressive discipline, and every step is the same. The only difference with the PIP is the timeline to improve gets shorter, and the consequences are clearly known that they're disciplinary and will increase in the nature of the discipline as you go, right? So it's just ramping it up. I've talked about this a few times about what needs to be in every letter. That's what needs to be in every letter. Again, you'll get a copy of this slide, so you'll be able to see that. A statement regarding expectations for sustained or consistent. This is important. Every performance, you should always see that statement when it talks about what you have to do to get better and consequences. You should always see the ramping up of consequences and expectations in every step. It has to be able, again, the word progressive and progressive discipline, performance management, the same progressive principle applies. Now we get to where the rubber hits the road. These are the 3 factors, because it's not the same for everybody. Just so you know, what you can terminate one person for cause for when it relates to performance is not going to be the same bar as what you can terminate another person for cause as it relates to performance. They're looking at 3 main factors, in the courts being the 3 main factors. The context and circumstances in question, the employee's length of service, super important. I'll give you a great piece of case law about that. And the nature and character of employment, again, equally important. So when we talk about these things, we talk about first the context of the circumstances. I have people all the time that come to me and say, yeah, this person's missed 3 days this week, they missed 2 days the next month, and we're going to terminate them for cause. In the bigger picture, folks, the courts don't view an employee missing 3 days a month or anything of that nature as egregious. Just so you know, it's not my opinion. I'm just letting you know that the courts they look at the first factor in what is willful misconduct, and they look at the term egregious, and they're measuring it up against things like misconduct, theft, sexual harassment, violence, insubordination, and then I get an employer who wants to terminate somebody because they missed 10 days in 2 months. The courts don't view it in the same light. So if you're going to terminate somebody for something like that, or if you're going to terminate somebody for cause, you have to look at you'll get all these factors inside. Look at all these different things, the duration and frequency of unsatisfactory performance, all these different things. If you're trying to jam a performance management system, especially for a more senior employee, if you're trying to jam it into 2 or 3 months, you're not going to get costs, period. The idea of performance management is you have to give people the time to improve. Improvement doesn't, even with a probationary period, the ESA gives 3 months for you to get out of the gate to try and learn your job before the employer has to make a decision without consequence. Same thing with performance management. The time between a performance management review and the next, even in a PIP, until you get to the last stage, should not be less than 3 months, ideally. Doesn't always work that way. Operational considerations come into play, but ideally it should be less than 3 months. Length of employment, stupid important. Okay. So if you have an employee who's worked for you for 10 years and then they have a bad year, and you put them through performance management, and then you get them about 1.5 years through performance management, and you say, we're going to terminate this person, and you were just going to discount the 10 years of good or solid service that happened before for what would be a year and a half of of what would be considered less than satisfactory performance, you better have a really strong case. or they satisfy the third option here. Okay, because courts do look at, there was the case that I was referring to, just want to see for time. Actually, we're going to skip it. Case we're referring to, an employee let a person's vest on fire in the workplace. The thing was a safety vest, so it went up in flames. The guy had first degree burns all over the body. They fired the guy who lit the thing up on fire. The arbitrator in that decision said the guy was an employee of 22 years service, never had a single thing, never had a single ounce of discipline on his record. He made an error in judgment by itself, does not constitute an egregious act. And you have to measure the years of service of good, non-disciplinary, exemplary service against one stupid act, and a termination for cause was over the hill. They had to pay him for the 3 months that process went through, give him a year's pay, and then give him his job back. So we're not talking about small consequences for not getting this right. And then the character of employment, simple. The more responsibility you have, the more obligation you have, right? The bigger the consequences. If you are a manager, it will be a heck of a lot easier to get a manager for termination with cause for lack of performance than it would be a minimum wage worker working at McDonald's, right? How much can they screw up where the act's considered egregious, right? So you have to understand that, and those are like end of the poll kind of examples, but the amount of responsibility someone has is important in the day-to-day. So our slide on the unionized environment, just so you know, we didn't forget about you. I tried to mix it in as we go. For those who don't know, and I know a lot of you do, I was a senior bargaining agent for about 11 years. I had 9 unions that I bargained with, and I ran a union shop with about 9 different unions of about approximately 1,000 employees. And I can tell you some unions are better than others, and that's just the way it is. The only thing you're ever going to do is, if you want to get performance management to work the best for you in a unionized environment, is to change the culture. Employers, and I mean the majority of unionized employers, treat performance management like it's a punitive tool. Failure out of the gate. You're never going to get anything you need out of that process. You might get a termination for cause or here and there, as long as it doesn't write like a performance or a disciplinary tool. But the way you use it is completely contrary to changing the culture. And on the other end, especially when you get into militant unions, if you're down the Windsor corridor in Ontario and things of that nature, a lot of unions and union members view it as a punitive tool and as a management tool to hold the worker down. So that's something that ideally, respectful communication, changing the culture, the idea that this is a cooperative process to make everybody better, that's something that has to happen right out of the gate. And the way you're going to get that is buy-in. You don't have to. And in certain cases, I don't recommend it at all. But tell the union people, come to the table. Like when you're doing something, like you don't have to, when you're going to give an employee, and this is a perfect example, when you're going to give an employee a piece of constructive criticism, you're not even going to put it in writing. It's not part of the formal process. That is performance management. You're just going to go and talk to them about something they need to improve on. You're going to pull them aside and have that conversation with them. You're not required to tell the union you're going to do that. That is, if they don't do it, the next step is not going to be discipline. That's a management right. But you know what? It would be wise on you, in certain cases, not all, to go to the union steward and say, by the way, just so you know, this employee is falling short here. I really would like to see them succeed. I'm going to do a little coaching with them. I just wanted to give you a heads up, and most of the time you're going to get the buy-in. Like you'll always have the militant union, but again, that goes back to changing the culture. You have to fix that to fix the other. But most of the time, the way you get that change of culture is to get the buy-in, to invite them to the table, even when they're not entitled to be there, even if they're only there as an observant. Communication, right? Again, the heads up piece that I just ahead of myself again, but communication is key to everything, whether it be union or non-union environments. Talking to your employees, talk to the union reps, not just your employees. They need to be part of the process wherever they can, even if it's an informal part of the process. So let's flip the script. Let's say you can't change the culture. You can't communicate with your employees or your union members, and you can't get buy-in. Let's talk about the more militant side of running a unionized shop, which I have very little problem with, actually quite enjoy. And it's nothing to do with unions. You're doing your job. It's something anyways, management runs the place. Okay. I'm an employer rep. So for my clients that are on this call, I know there's a handful of you and it's great. Good to see you. You guys know, or you all know, I'm an employer rep. I go to town, I go to bat for my employers. I go to bat for my clients, and I view it from the lens of I will try and make things as awesome as I can for your culture and your company and your employees. But at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, I'm on your side, right? No different than performance management. And the unions, like I say this with medical, when you get a medical note and it says, off work for 1 week, and you say you don't have to accept that. The employee doesn't work for the doctor. The union members don't work for the union. The union members work for you. So remember that coaching, constructive criticism, performance management is a manager right, even when you have to involve unions in the performance management process when it becomes disciplinary or the likelihood of it becoming disciplinary comes into play, it's still a management right. You still run the show. Okay. Document. This is important in all things HR. If you are in HR and you don't know what's the most important thing you do in HR, document, document, document. So I think that's every classroom teacher. Anyways, but it's a super important with a unionized environment. The reason being is, let's say you're not going to be one of those employers, and even if you are, you still need to do it. But let's say you're not going to be one of those employers that encourages buy-in with the union and involves them in processes that they don't need to be involved in, right? You're going to go through 2 or 3 steps of performance management before the union formally gets involved. They're going to want to know what happened. They're going to want to know what led up to that point. And if you don't have proper documentation, you're dead in the water, right? So it's stupid important in a unionized environment to make sure you're meticulous about how you document performance management concerns, even if it isn't in the formal, like if you're talking to, you have that constructive criticism talk or coaching talk with somebody in the hall, go back to your office, write it down in a note and stick it in a file somewhere. So when you do have to issue a performance management appraisal and bring up past incidents, you can rely on that and you have something in writing in real time that you can turn to and show the union rep if need be. And finally, timing. One of the most common unionized tactics I've had it tried on me, and with much success, especially when I was younger in my career, where a union member or a union steward was like, yeah, we need an answer now. Like my employee isn't doing this job right now, and that's it. Like this is unfair. We're reserving the right to grieve. I'm pulling my employer out, find other work for them to do. You know what? No. Again, management rights. The idea that you can do work now, grieve later actually works, unless you are potentially putting them in a hazardous health and safety situation 90% of the time. So this is a 10% caveat. 90% of the time when you tell an employee to do something, even if they think it's contrary to their collective agreement, they have to do it. Okay. If they want to grieve it later. And that's a perfectly acceptable response. I will tell you this, when I actually got better and got wise, a little bit more wise in my job in a unionized environment, I found that 8 out of every 10 times when I said you don't use the words like work now, grieve later, but you know where you're going with it. When I said to somebody, work now, grieve later, and whatever, wording that was, 8 out of 10 times they never grieved. They were upset about something that they didn't need to be upset about. Most of the time they were upset about something or thought something about their rights were being violated that weren't being violated at all. We're well within my management right. So 8 out of 10 times I got the job done that I needed to get done, or supported my frontline manager the way I needed to support my frontline manager from a director's point of view. And 8 out of 10 times I never got a grievance, because again, in the moment, a union or a union member, and they're trained to do this in some cases, will push you to make a management right their right. You can't let that happen. So super important. Again, the left side of the screen is for how you would like it to be and how you should try to make it be. The right side of the screen is the reality for a lot of unionized employers. So if you will indulge me for literally 60 seconds, I would just like to tell you a little bit about our services, and literally 60 seconds and we'll flip right to Q&A. Okay, and I'll make sure it's worth your while. HR Covered, we are a membership-based company. We do ad hoc stuff, but really our value comes in our memberships. You can call or email us anytime you want. We provide unlimited documents, unlimited training. We do health and safety. We do everything from the employee life cycle. We have a great recruiting team, phenomenal recruitment team, and we do right through to termination. So you can call us up and say, listen, we want to terminate this person. Can we do it with cause? If not, how much is it going to cost? Can you do the letter up for us? Can you give us a full and final release? We do it all for you. It's unlimited. And then of course, HR strategy. We have a consulting arm, so any one-offs you need, we can do. We have a recruiting arm, which I already spoke to, and we have HRC Law. So we have a team of lawyers. It's a separate membership that you can merge with your actual membership, but they provide this product, which is unparalleled in Canada. It's unlimited legal advice. There's no retainer. There's no per hour thing. You pay a membership for the year. You can call your lawyer as many times as you want. It's pretty cool, right? So that's it. That's my my selfless shelf promotion. Thank you everybody for attending. I hope that Targil's pretty happy. He's excited about the end of the webinar, celebrating. So I hope everybody took at least one thing away that they may be able to use going forward. And if not, at least it was hopefully a helpful recap. And I really enjoy doing these webinars, and I look forward to doing another next month, and happy to answer all your HR questions. So if you bear with me, usually Mark gives me a hand with this part. I'm just going to flip into the Q&A part and answer some of these questions. So a good example is, can we have an example of this discrimination being embedded into the hiring process? I can give you a really simple example. There's a lot of hiring procedure processes that I've talked to that talk about one, status. So it'll talk about in the hiring process, it'll ask, are you legally able to work in Canada, right? That's fine, but you'll see a lot of questions. And again, the employer doesn't think anything of it. Do you have a valid permanent, whatever, a visa or permanent residency? You can't ask if someone has a permanent residency. They only have to be able to legally work in Canada right now, when you're doing the hiring. If they have a temporary visa and it might expire in 6 months, and there's a process they can go through to get it extended or get it made permanent, that's the only thing you're allowed to be aware. So in that case, you're discriminating. You also get questions in a hiring process that talk about family. Quite often you'll have people talk about, what are your plans for your family? Or they'll just in a casual conversation. Trust me, I've had it happen to me. And literally, because I get called in this all the time. It's the nature of what we live in right now. It's what it is. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Most of it's good for the intent, but some people manipulate it. But at the end of the day, when you start having a conversation about kids or something in a hiring process, you got to be careful. That person doesn't get the job. They come back and say, I didn't get it because I'm a mom and I have kids and I might want to expand my family. And that's why I didn't get hired. So these are things that you have to go back and look at, what's in your hiring policy. What are the questions you're asking and say, okay, that is a case where discrimination, questions that could lead to an answer that would cause me to, with my unconscious self, say this isn't the right person for the job, right? So hopefully that's a good example. There's tons of them out there. Will we receive a copy of this presentation? Kathleen, yes, you will. So everybody will be getting a copy of the presentation. I believe Sony will be sending that out. And you'll also get a follow-up call to make sure that you enjoyed the presentation. If there was anything that else that you wanted to either us talk about going forward, any other questions you had that we didn't answer today. So we'll make sure that you're taken care of. Another question from Baptiste. What, if I'm pronouncing that right, begging your pardon, what if an employee is badly hurting the organization and you need to terminate this employee? Last example was an employee misrepresenting themselves as a manager and started negotiating contracts without our knowledge. How fast can we through? Okay. The last part of that question, how fast can we move to performance management and disciplinary sanction, unionized work environment? This is not a performance issue. So it's very clear there's 3 processes that dominate the HR landscape. In a perfect world, you would have the 3 separated, but it's more common that 2 of them merge. So there's performance management. Disciplinary issues don't go into performance management. You can't double dip. You can't do the double jeopardy thing. That's a term for termination or for discipline. But in reality, you can't put something that's in the performance management system and then put it also in discipline. It doesn't work that way. It's one process or the other. The other thread is attendance management, right? Because attendance is wrought with actual non-culpable absenteeism and disabilities and things that can be explained and justified and no way would warrant a termination with cause. So it should have its own process. Most employers, for the sake that attendance management is an incredibly costly and legal process, merge attendance management in with their progressive discipline. In this case, the example you're using us, if they misrepresented themselves as a manager and negotiated a contract without your knowledge, that's termination worthy. Even in a unionized environment, I would be pushing for termination with cause on the basis of breach for trust. That's my opinion without knowing all of the facts just out of the gate. Odds are, in cases like that, the union will grieve it, and you may consider, bargaining down to a last chance discipline, whatever the discipline process outlined in the CA. But you'd be wise whenever you're in a unionized environment, as awful as this sounds, because the union grieves everything in most cases, you would be wise to, go the length to what you need to go to leave yourself the latitude to bargain down, right? Kathleen again, what you do training to managers in my agency. I don't necessarily understand the question, so I apologize. But what you do, so we do training for all employees. So we provide online training. We will do in-person training. If you're asking what training is needed for a company in Canada, every single jurisdiction has required training. But this type of training, performance management training and coaching training, that is absolutely something every company should do, and it is something we offer. So by all means, my number is up on the screen as well as my email address. Kathleen, if you want to reach out about that afterwards, it's great. Neil Leslie, thanks, Darcy, great presentation. Just became a member of HR Covered. Congratulations and thank you for being a member, that's great. We'll make sure you're taken care of. So I will look for you, by the way, Neil, and see who your consultant's going to be. And I might even pop in on a call somewhere along the line. Ian, if the employee disagrees with the evaluation and expresses it verbally or in writing, how does that factor into the overall evaluation? Does it devalue the strength of the evaluation? How do you recommend handling that process? I think it's healthy. Does it really, actually, it's a great question. It's a great question in progressive discipline. It's just the answer is different in progressive discipline, but it's a great question for performance management. Again, this is a management process. The employee doesn't get the opportunity to evaluate themselves. Some processes allow that, but that's what it is. But at the end of the day, this is a management tool. This is an employer tool. So your evaluation of the employee is in fact your evaluation, and it's the only thing that matters. Now, that said, one of the aspects that you really want to achieve out of performance management is, a better rapport and better performance from your employee. And if they actually feel as if they're being wronged in their evaluation, you should give them the opportunity to put that in writing or verbally, and then you should meaningfully discuss it. You should sit down with them, and if it's in writing, you should go through all of their points and say, okay, you believe this after this constructive feedback. Here's the reasoning for our constructive feedback, and explain it to them and say, tell me if I'm wrong. There's a possibility that you might be, right? For all those different things we talked about, horns and halo, biases, lack of differentiation, your tend means towards the middle. All those different things could mean that, maybe the lens you were looking through is a little bit wrong. At the end of the day, 9 out of every 10 times, the employer is not wrong. That's just what it is. And, especially with younger generations, in my experience, and this is not an HR piece of advice, is just it's an old person's person's advice. I find that constructive criticism, because it's not something that's been readily shared through schools, has passed into the workplace. So it's more of a challenge to pass that along and have it accepted. But at the end of the day, to answer your other question, it doesn't devalue your performance management process at all. It is a management tool, right? Your say is your say. As long as you can support your say with tangible facts or tangible examples, you'll be fine, even if you end up in court. If you're doing progressive discipline, as I mentioned earlier, if you're asking someone to sign the progressive discipline note, it denotes to the employee that you're somehow asking for their permission or their agreement that they're being disciplined. I totally disagree with that play. If I'm disciplining somebody, it's because they did something wrong. It's not because I'm trying to make them better. It's because they did something wrong. And at the end of the day, I don't need to give them the idea that somehow I seek their approval. And it does, because at the end of the day, you'll have employees where you discipline them and they walk away because they didn't sign it, thinking that, I somehow I'm validated. It's not the best practice in the world, in my opinion. How do you apply a PM in non-for-profit organization that's working with a strict budget? How do you increase productivity? How do you arrive at the reward and recognize it? Okay, so recognition first. I get the recognition part with the performance, with the non-for-profits and stuff like that. Recognition doesn't always have to be monetary rewards. Sometimes it could be verbal praise. Sometimes it can be giving someone a Friday afternoon off. There's a lot of different things that are, you can allow them to, if you're going to have a lunch day or you can allow them to pick a theme for a lunch or whatever it is. There's lots of different things which surely we can talk about that you can do in a non-for-profit organization to recognize your employees. I tried to make a point a couple of times about tying ROI to, your goals for performance management in a for-profit organization. In a nonprofit organization, typically what you find is it's the delivery of your services that are key. You don't need the money to make money. You need the money to be able to effectively and appropriately deliver your services. So if that's your end goal, how do we effectively and appropriately deliver our services so it's meaningful for who it is we're trying to support or help? Then that's what your job description should be tied to. What do these employees need to do to help us reach that goal? And in between your job description and your goals is your performance management system. Let's measure how they're doing with these duties and these responsibilities to help us achieve that. The one thing non-for-profits got going for them, and I know it's a difficult job market, so this isn't always the case anymore, is typically, in my experience, and I've worked with a ton of non-for-profits, and HR Covered works with a ton of non-for-profits. In my experience, the employees that work for non-for-profits, a good deal of them anyways, do so because of the passion and do so because of the purpose for which they're there. So recognizing and encouraging and supporting employees to support the goal for which they're there for and working at, probably at a reduced rate at that, is something that could be a very effective tool in a non-for-profit. And I'd be happy to have that conversation with you at any point. Just give me a call or send me an email. No, like completely pro bono. Anything I can do to help a non-for-profit who's trying to do their best, given their obstacles, I'm happy to help. I think we are, yes, we're past 3 o'clock. So for those, I have some time to answer some more questions. So for those people who want to stay on, you're more than welcome. I'll go through it. Other questions, we have a few more questions left to answer. For those people who have to leave, completely understand. And thank you for joining us today. And hopefully we see you next month. Not sure what the topic is yet, but we'll hopefully see you next month. A poor performing employee has a medical note to be off work, but says he can't, but a medical note to be off work, but says he can still work. Does the company face potential liability if we agree to have him to work during this time, knowing the specific needs off? What if they issue discipline during this period for poor performance? Okay, that's a loaded question because there's about 3 different questions at once and it gets relatively complicated. Technically, you do incur some liability. So it really depends on your risk tolerance. So I'll use a workers' compensation kind of teaching that I share with clients and was shared with me when I worked with the board, is basically at the end of the day, the treating medical practitioner is they're a player and they're an important player in this entire process, but they're not the decision maker. They do not tell the employer that they have to make somebody work or not work. At a certain point, they'll provide appropriate and satisfactory medical, which will dictate to you that they can't work. And that's understandable. But if the employee feels as if they can do duties and you're confident in that employee's judgment, and even though the doctor says that they can't, I would be seeking for more detailed medical. I would actually send it a non-occupational functional abilities form, which is very similar to a occupational workplace, a workers' compensation functional abilities form. It's just narrowed down and it talks about restrictions and capabilities, which is probably because somewhere in between the devil and the devil's in the details. There's probably a lot of things that they can do about his job, but the vagueness of the medical note doesn't allow you to pick those things out. So an FAF would be good, but at the end of the day, if the employee wants to work, and you are willing to let them work and you trust their judgment, yes, there's some liability there, but that's your call. The employee works for you, you provide the work to the employee. As far as the issues of discipline, that's something that you're gonna have to eat a little bit. At a certain point, like when I get into a point where I have somebody that I've allowed to come back to work on a gradual return to work or something together and their performance isn't meeting their expectations, whether it be without the medical or with the medical, I will explain to that person, instead of disciplining them, I will explain to that person that clearly, even though your desire to be back is great, and we appreciate that, you're not ready to be here yet. So for that reason, we're going to have to adhere to your medical note and place you on a leave of absence. Here's your here's your ROE, go apply for EI or apply for STD if you have that program. So there's a lot of claims management principles that you have to go over there. But yeah, it's not if you're not getting, like, I try to answer as concisely as I can, but there is no black and white answer there. That is not a question that's going to have a concrete, this is the way you do it. There's a lot of different scenarios at play, but I would start off from the beginning. Whenever you get medical that is contradictory with what you think you can or should do, get more medical. An FAF is the thing to do. Okay. So I think this is the last question, unless anybody else pops in, from Jackie. Where do you suggest we get management training for performance management process? Does HR Cover provide this, or we can do that? So please do reach out. We have a couple of people on our team, one in particular, who is a terrific coach. So I'd be happy to make that introduction, and he would be able to take it from there. We also have a female HR person who's a terrific coach, so we can provide one or both. So I appreciate the question and thinking of us, and by all means, my email address and numbers on the screen. And I'll just tie it off here on behalf of Sony and the rest of the gang at HR Covered. Thank you for your attendance. I hope that this was a valuable program for you and that you learned something, if not lots. Tar Heel, very grateful and excited, as you can see. And we'll get this all out to you after the presentation, or everything that we've promised you, we'll get out to you within the next coming days, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Take care.